Hi, everyone. Thank you for being here today. My name is Zia Jones, and I'm one of the regional trainers for Journalists for Human Rights on their Solutions Project. I'm joined here by my colleague, Kimberly Hartwig, who is just trying to share her screen.
Trying to share my screen. Sorry, just give me 1 second here. But while you guys are here, you should be able to see a link in the chat. You can go ahead and follow that link to a short quiz. And if you're feeling brave after you've gotten your score, you can share it with the rest of us.
So for anyone who's joining us just now, there's a link to this quiz in the chat. We're asking everybody to take a few minutes to go through it and then to share your results in the chat. Let us know how you did. So we've got one person responding so far saying they got 15% on the quiz. Anyone else willing to be brave? Someone else says, I did not do well at all.
No shame in that. I didn't do very well when I first took it either.
I think that my result was around 28%, something to that effect. Certainly not a passing grade. Got another brave soul admitting to getting 23%. Someone got 77, which is, I think, the highest I've ever seen anyone get. Followed by an 8%.
Not the first time I've seen that score either.
Someone else says that they got 23% and they thought they were informed.
We'll give you just a couple more minutes to finish up the quiz as we wait for anyone else to join.
Loving everyone's use of text-based emojis in the chat. Haven't seen a 0 underscore or O underscore O for a while. So we've got a few more people saying they got scores in the 30s and 20s, a 38%, a 38%, another 28%. I think we see a pattern here. Kim, should we move on possibly?
Sure. If you have a couple more questions left, you can finish up if you want, but otherwise, let's
Get started. All right. Just give me 1 second here, rearrange my windows. So hello, my name is Kim, and I'm here today with my colleague Zia, and we are going to be speaking to you about how to cover human rights from a solutions lens. We work for Journalists for Human Rights, a media development organization in Canada, and we have partnered with the Solutions Journalism Network for the first time this year to bring you this training. The solutions journalism approach is one I'm very passionate about, and I'm excited to be teaching you more about it today. And if you have any questions at any point in the presentation, you can feel free to drop them in the chat, and we can either answer them as we go, or also we'll have some time for questions at the end. So there are a couple things that we are hoping you will take from the presentation today, and those are what human rights journalism and solutions journalism are and how they work together, how to identify the key elements of a solutions journalism story, how to identify the key elements of how to develop and report on human rights stories using a solutions journalism approach, and how you as a journalist can use these two approaches together. And finally, how solutions journalism can strengthen audience growth and engagement. We hope that this project will bring human rights and solutions journalism into newsrooms in a sustained way. So the first thing we'll do is just watch a short video where some solutions journalism journalists are going to talk about the framework and why they use it. I see that you might not have been able to hear that audio, so let me try to share my screen one more time, and hopefully we can get this working this time. Share sound.
Let's share sound.
Okay, let's try this again this time.
Solutions journalism to me means taking a different approach to journalism.
Solutions journalism is actually completing the job of reporting.
Solutions journalism is about balance.
Not just looking at the problem, but also exploring ways to solve the problem.
And we're trying to help our town or our county or our city or our state progress to a better place.
It's a critical part of how we resolve a crisis.
Traditional media has been really great at reporting what the problems are. Solutions journalism is a way of looking at the other side of the story.
We need to deeply dig in, find out what's working, how it's working, and why.
Solutions journalism is a way to take away the excuses of people who are doing a bad job.
It's easy to forget that people are solving those problems.
Solutions journalism offers a lens into new possibilities.
It's very forward-looking. It's a new kind of product.
It's going out and reporting a story and then kind of taking that additional step and looking at the bigger impact of that.
Society solving problems. That's useful for our audience, it's useful for other people in the field.
Just empowering them, just letting them know there is a solution.
If no one is talking about the solutions, they won't bother to emulate them.
It's about going beyond demolition to construction.
Solutions journalism gives audiences a way to look into the future and imagine new possibilities.
Solutions journalism is what we should have been doing all along.
So next I will talk to you a little bit about what exactly human rights journalism is. So as I mentioned, Zia and I are coming to you from Journalists for Human Rights. And Journalists for Human Rights' mission is to enhance human rights, including freedom of expression and access to information through media development. We train journalists around the world to cover human rights stories. That coverage increases press freedom, public accountability, and dialogue. It also creates more public support for and engagement with journalism. The Indigenous Reporters Program, for example, has increased the quality and quantity of Indigenous stories and voices in Canadian media through training and mentorship. Journalists for Human Rights trains journalists to mainstream human rights awareness into daily journalism. We encourage journalists to redefine stories as human rights stories. This includes identifying whose rights are being affected. These people are known as the rights holders. Holding those responsible to protect, uphold, or enforce those rights accountable. Those people are known as the duty bearers. Describing what the human rights issue is at play in the story, and outlining what realistically could be done about the issue by relevant local authorities in order to better uphold the rights of those affected in the community. And Journalists for Human Rights works with the ripple effect. So the first step is for journalists on the ground to get human rights reporting training. From there, media organizations are able to publish those stories. People hear, read, or watch these stories and go on to share them with their wider social networks. The community is then able to start talking about the human rights issues, and the community members can push for change. Whenever we're writing a human rights story, there are a couple ingredients that always need to be present. So first we have participation. Rights media ensures that not only the events, but also the voices of those affected by the media events are presented in the story. Next, we have accountability. Rights media ensures that those allegedly responsible are asked to speak to the rights violation or abuse. Next, we have non-discrimination. Rights media does not discriminate by valuing one human right over another or group of people over another. Next, we have empowerment. Rights media is accessible by the communities of those affected by the issue. And finally, linkage to human rights. Rights media ensures that human rights stories source human rights doctrines relevant to the event and community. Now I'll just speak briefly about why Solutions Journalism and Journalists for Human Rights have decided to come together for this project. As I mentioned, Journalists for Human Rights and the Solutions Journalism Network began a partnership this year, and we're working together to expand human rights coverage in Canada. Economic development, community improvement, gender equality, and diversity are just some of the areas where Solutions Journalism can expand the quality of human rights reporting. The goal of this project is to have solutions journalism and human rights journalism approaches introduced and sustained in Canada, leading to the following anticipated developments. More public support for and engagement with journalism that more fully covers the whole story, more real-world impact from journalism, more revenue for endangered news organizations, increased trust in Canadian institutions, and increased interpersonal trust. So now let's talk about what exactly solutions journalism is. So just like with human rights reporting, there are a couple pillars that we always need to hit to write a solutions story. So first, it must feature not a person, but a response to a problem and how it happened. We aren't just pointing out how great a person or a program is. We're looking at the response they put into place and the steps it took to do so. Next, we'll provide available evidence of results, looking at effectiveness, not just intentions. And we don't have to have years of hard data to write a solution story. Sometimes evidence is simply someone from the community being served by the response explaining how they were helped. These stories can happen at any point in a response. Next, we seek to provide insights that can help others respond, not just inspiration. We want solutions to be replicable and for readers to understand how they could work in their own communities. Finally, a solutions story will discuss limitations to avoid reading like a puff piece. The strongest solutions journalism stories use the rigor of investigative reporting to explore systemic, underlying reasons for social ills, and then critically examine efforts to address them. We're reporting on solutions as rigorously as we report on problems. If you need an acronym to help you remember these pillars, you can remember that solutions journalism aims to tell the whole story. So W here stands for what the response is and what does it address. H for how it works, or the how done it. O for the fact that it offers insight. L for the limitations, and E for the evidence. If you would like more examples of what a solutions story can look like, I heavily suggest that you check out the Solutions Journalism Story Tracker. Currently, there are over 10,000 stories in the Story Tracker, and all of them have been vetted by a real live human being. You can search by solution location, issue area, journalist, or success factor. It's a really great tool to educate yourself more about solutions journalism and what types of articles people are creating. Next, I'll briefly talk to you about why human rights journalism is important and why you should use it in your newsroom. So the problem is that corruption, crime, and human rights abuses are able to thrive when the media is weak. When media does not cover human rights issues, people are not aware of issues in their communities or of their rights. Human rights abuses continue because the abusers are not worried about getting caught or being held to accountability. The solution is for media to put a spotlight on local human rights issues. People are then able to learn about the issue, and they can demand changes and accountability. Human rights training gives reporters the skills and tools to report on human rights issues ethically and objectively, giving voice to the voiceless and helping to change lives. So let's take a look at how human rights journalism and solutions journalism can work together to create change. This story here comes from 2019, and it's by the Cleveland Plain Dealer. They put together a special report about a topic that had been covered many times: how the presence of lead in paint was making people who lived in rental homes sick, and landlords weren't doing anything about it. Neither was the city. The series began with a traditional investigation, this time of the intersection of lead paint and race. But this time, the Plain Dealer decided to do something a little bit differently. Instead of simply reporting on the human rights abuses, the paper looked at how other similar cities had addressed the issue and what was stopping Cleveland from putting in measures of its own. For example, the Plain Dealer went to Rochester, New York, a city that had had considerable success against lead paint, to write about what Rochester did. A chart in the paper said, here's what successful cities do, and here's what Cleveland does. You can imagine that this was embarrassing to public officials in a way that simply revealing the problem was not. A problem that was seen as unavoidable became seen as unacceptable. And change followed pretty immediately after this article was published. The city began to adopt the best practices of its neighbors. In addition, Cleveland's health department director and 3 or 4 deputy commissioners were fired or resigned. City lead inspection staff rose from 3 to 7. The city passed a plan that proactively inspects rental homes for the first time, modeled on programs highlighted in the series. The state threatened the city unless it complied with a list of reforms. And the state published a list of banned homes. Cleveland now posts warning signs on affected homes. And all of these changes started taking place after the journalists showed that better was indeed possible. I'm now going to hand it over to my colleague Zia, and they will continue to tell you why you should use solutions journalism in your newsroom.
Thank you, Kim. So I'm just going to share my screen here. All right, can everybody see my screen? Good? Okay. So just gonna check the chat quickly. Great. Okay, so when it comes to why we should use solutions journalism, the Cleveland Plain Dealer example dovetails really nicely into this. Because the first idea is that it can make your reporting more impactful. So like you saw with the Cleveland story, it wasn't enough to just be pointing out the problems. The journalists also had to talk about what the alternatives were. And it wasn't until it became so obvious what could be done to change the status quo that change actually happened. As journalists, we tend to think of ourselves as whistleblowers, and we see it as our job to expose wrongdoing. And we think that if we are simply pointing out problems, that's what's going to spur reform. Sometimes that is the case. There are these huge explosive stories that really move the needle, but a lot of the times we end up returning to the same stories over and over and over again. That's because in the real world, and according to everybody other than journalists, journalism's theory of change is a bit more complicated. We do need to expose wrongdoing, and we do need to talk about those social ills, but we also have to take away excuses by showing that something better is possible. And when we're pointing out social problems and the models that we have for solving them, that's what's going to ultimately spur reform. The second reason is that it is just good journalism. So if you were reading the news in 2014, you probably remember Ebola, and a lot of the headlines about it looked a lot like this. They were very fear-mongering. The message was very much Ebola is coming. We are all going to get very, very sick. Lots of people are going to die, and there's nothing that we can do about it. Of course, it was a very serious disease, and a lot of people did fall ill and die. However, it didn't materialize the way that we expected it to. And after a while, it just sort of disappeared from the news cycle and we didn't hear much about it again. But did you know that several countries, including Nigeria, which were bordering countries that had really bad Ebola outbreaks, were able to keep their case counts really low, in some cases in the single or low double digits. So there was a lot of evidence that communities were actually able to stem the spread of Ebola as opposed to it running rampant. And did you know that there was a vaccine? This was something that I didn't know until I started working on this curriculum. And did you know that there were actually treatments for Ebola? This is all really useful information that would have been great to know at the time, and that made up a really important set of pieces of the story. And when we're thinking about things like COVID now, for example, understanding how to say stop the spread or contain the spread of a virulent virus or disease would be very useful to know. And so we see a problem here. If we're covering a response without addressing, or we're covering a problem rather without addressing the associated responses, then we're leaving out really critical information. And ultimately, that information is what we're going to need to create change as a society. So when we're not talking about the responses and we're only talking about the problems, we're doing a disservice to our readers. We're leaving them less informed, and that's not what we want to be doing. The final reason is that it can help us to boost audience engagement and trust. So every year, Reuters does a study of news habits. And in 2018, they looked at news avoidance as a habit. They asked people, are you avoiding the news? And if so, why? So among the people who said, yes, I am avoiding the news, 48% of them said, I'm doing so because it has a negative effect on my mood. 28% of people who were avoiding the news said that they were doing so because they felt like there was nothing that they could do about it when they were reading about negative stories in the news. And that really reveals like a relatable pattern, I think, right? I often have to turn off Twitter or not look at some of my push notifications because some stories just seem too dire. And that we're not, if we're only talking about the problems in these stories, then other people are going to have a similar response. If people are turning away from the news and they're not coming back to us, that's an issue for our bottom lines and also for our goals as journalists to keep people informed. So this news avoidance is a real thing. It's not just sort of anecdotal, and it's something that we should be mindful of. On the other hand, solutions journalism has been shown to start to fight against some of those problems. So last year, for example, the Center for Media Engagement found that when stories had all of the solutions journalism elements, readers felt like the articles were of higher quality. They had more of an intention to engage with the text. People said that they had more interest and knowledge about the issues. So not only were they going and reading them in the first place, but they were engaging with them more deeply. They also talked about having more of an intention to read more about the issue. So this is something to keep in mind if we're looking at a topic that we're covering a lot or that we want to be returning to. People are going to be more invested if they feel like there's some sort of way out, and if there is some sort of solution or response that can be applied to the sort of things that we're talking about. Readers also said that they were more positive and that they wanted to, they felt like there was something that they could actually do about the issues. So they really did feel as though there was some kind of alternative when they were reading stories that talked about responses and that talked about solutions, not solely problems. Seattle Times offers a really interesting look at the way that solutions journalism stacks up against regular reporting because they have their education labs column, and that's a bunch of education stories that are all told from a solutions angle, and they also do just regular education coverage. They decided to compare those two, and what they found was that the solution stories garnered 102% more page views. People spend 80% more time on the page with those stories, and they had 230% more social shares. So people were more attracted to those stories in the first place. They were engaging with them more deeply, spending more time with them, and they were more likely to say like, hey, other people, you should read these. Let's talk a bit now about how we can actually cover human rights stories through a solutions lens and how we can start to put some of these stories together ourselves. Strangely, perhaps the first step to finding a story is to make sure that you can identify your problem or your issue of concern as precisely as possible. If you don't start with a particular problem that you want to address, then you're going to end up with a nice story about someone who's doing a good thing, and that might still be a worthwhile story, but it's not going to be solutions journalism. In order to narrow down our problems as precisely as we can, we use a method called slices. We start with our big slice problem, and that's a piece of a big problem that no one sort of small response is going to fix. So you might say something like poverty. No matter what you do, no one response is going to alleviate poverty. So that would be, for example, our big slice. When you have your big slice, you want to ask yourself who is doing it well compared to others with the same resources, and who has made newsworthy improvements in this area. After that, you want to break it down into a smaller slice. And you can do that by asking yourself, what's a piece of this that's really important to my audience, and who is doing a better job with that small piece? Better can mean a lot of things. It can be cheaper, faster, more equitably or accessibly, with better oversight. It could be with better results for subgroups like youth, refugees, LGBTQ+ folks, etc. A couple more examples of big and small slices. If your big slice is childhood well-being, for example, your small slice might be churches, the family system, foster care, youth in prison. If reproductive health is your big slice, teen pregnancy might be your small slice, gestational diabetes, postpartum depression, access to contraception, that kind of thing. I see the chat lighting up. Are there any questions that I should be addressing now, or keep going?
I'll just jump in to let people know that yes, we will be sending out this slide deck after we have finished the presentation. So don't feel like you need to rush and take a lot of notes. You will be getting the slides.
Great. Another place that we can look for stories is by using something called a positive deviant and working backwards from a positive outcome. Generally, when we look at data, for example, as journalists, we tend to look for the place that's doing the worst job and talk about how they got to that negative place. But we can approach it from the flip side and look at somebody who's doing a better job than most and how they got there. If you see that there are examples of places that are doing much better than other comparable areas, you can look to those places and ask, how did they achieve that success, and what is keeping other people from doing the same thing? There are a number of other places you might look for these stories. You can consult people in places like think tanks and policy experts. Academics love to talk about their work, don't necessarily get a chance to do it as often as they would like, and have a good broad sense of their sort of field of study a lot of the time. So they might have ideas about who is putting solutions into place or what kind of solutions need to be put into place. Large data sets, if you want to look for those positive deviants. People involved in the implementation and people involved in the problem, those on-the-ground community members are going to have a really good sense of what they need, what does work, what doesn't work. And there might even be people who are already starting to put some of these solutions into play. They might be good ones to check as well, to talk about what might be done differently. Networks of innovators. Holding a mirror up to our own lives. If we're noticing the same problems in our own lives over and over again, if we see that there are certain solutions that are working in our communities, maybe we want to see if there are some newsworthy stories to be told there. Like we said, the solutions story tracker, if there's a specific issue and that you want to cover and you want to see how other people have reported on responses or solutions, you can look there. And when you're going to these sources, you always want to be asking who is doing it better. Who's doing a better job at addressing this issue, and what tactics are they using? In terms of finding the best solution, the good news is you absolutely do not have to, and in fact, you can't. There is no such thing as a perfect solution, and it's not your job to find out who's doing the best job. There's always going to be someone doing it better. There's always going to be limitations to the work that people are doing. So your job isn't to find something flawless or something that addresses every single facet of the issue. It's just your job to report the news. So you want to be looking for newsworthy improvements and talking about how they came to be and what they look like in practice. There are a number of ways that we can frame solution stories. We've put up 6 here. They're not the only 6, but they're some of the most common and straightforward. So we'll talk a little bit about each of them. There's the Everyday Beat story, and that's a fresh look at a topic that's been deemed too depressing. So this is an example from the Globe and Mail, and it's a look at a team of community response officers that were put into place in a First Nation in the Yukon. The community had been complaining about racialized violence at the hand of police, and so they decided to look at alternatives to classic police modes. So they put in a team of unarmed community response officers who were sent to respond to some of the calls that police would typically respond to. And they looked at what the results were there, what worked, what didn't. There's the Positive Deviant. So this is a story about an Ontario hospital that convinced a number of its patients to donate their organs after they had died. And this hospital was able to convince more people than any other hospital in the province to do so. So they looked at how this actually came to be, where the hospital started, how they got to the result that they have now, and what they did differently from other hospitals in order to produce such a positive result. There's the Local Transformation. This is a story from an American publication, but it's looking at a Canadian story. They looked at the Toronto District School Board and how the school board was able to phase out policing and police officers from its schools. They looked at where the Toronto District School Board started, the different work that went into ultimately getting police officers out of schools, and the article asked the readers to consider whether or not this could be replicated in US school districts as well. There's the Quickie. So that's a quick look at a problem and a solution to that problem. This is to show that these stories can be done really quickly. They can be done in less than 800 words. They can be done in a 2-minute radio spot. As long as it has those 4 elements of solutions journalism, you can write or produce a solution story. There's the apples to apples comparison. So that's looking at 2 different places that are comparable and how one might learn from another. This is a Canadian story, again, from the St. Albert Today, which is based in Alberta. And they're looking at the cost of childcare in Quebec, which is much lower than it is in Alberta, rather. And they're asking, what can Alberta learn from Quebec in order to bring its childcare costs down? And then finally, there's the How Done It, which is the who, what, when, where, why, a chronological look at how a place got from a problem to a response. This is another story about Quebec, this time from The Guardian, looking at how the province convinced more parents to take paternal leave. They look at, again, where Quebec started and how they actually were able to convince parents to take more equitable leave. So to sum it up, solutions journalism happens when reporters are regularly asking their sources who is doing a better job, who is doing it better, and when they regularly ask themselves, is there a possible solutions angle to this story? Not every story that we do is going to be solutions journalism. There are tons of other useful and helpful forms of journalism, like, service pieces and personal essays, and sometimes it's too early in a response too early in a problem rather to necessarily talk about a response. So not every single story has to be a solution story, but the journalists and the newsrooms who are doing solutions journalism the most successfully are the ones who are doing it regularly and who are regularly asking themselves that question: is there a possible solutions angle? If you're looking for a bit more information, one resource that I'd like to point you to is the Learning Lab, which lives on the Solutions Journalism Network's website. And it's a bunch of basic toolkits in a number of languages that talk about how to cover solution stories for specific beats. So they have modules about violence, for example, education. There is going to be one for visual journalists and investigative reporters. And they're sort of self-led modules. They are also free. So if you ever have time and you want to look into those, I encourage it. And now, oops. There are also a few other avenues that you can look into. There's the Solutions Journalism Network, which you can join. That will give you access to the Solution Story Tracker, which you can browse and also add stories to yourself. It will also put you in touch with different solutions journalism story newsletters that you can sign up for. I get a couple of them every week. It's nice to see examples of what other people are doing. You can join the Solutions Journalism Network Facebook page. There you'll find more opportunities like this workshop posted. They'll do follow-up workshops that often get posted in that group. They will also sometimes post opportunities for grants related to solutions journalism. So if you are a freelancer and you're looking to get funding to do solutions journalism, that could be a good place to start. Like I said, you can sign up for those newsletters and look at our Facebook page as well, or our Twitter. And we will be offering 4 Pillars workshops, or somebody at the Solutions Journalism Network will be offering the 4 Pillars workshops. And that's a closer look at all of those pillars that we talked about, those 4 elements, talking a bit more about how they can play out in stories. So now we'll take some questions if there are any. You can feel free to drop any questions you have into the chat. They'll be shared with us. You've got us for 20 more minutes, so we've got some time. Kim, were there any questions added?
Sorry, I was muted. Not any questions that I've seen, but if anyone wasn't able to register, make sure that you drop your email in the chat link, and that way we can make sure that you will get the slide deck. Oh, here we've got a question. Do you find that solution stories are more time-consuming to report than others? It is an issue that a lot of news outlets have. They're quite pressed for time. And a question that they often have is, can we work this into our daily reporting schedule? Zia, did you want to speak to that a bit?
Sure. So they can be more time consuming. It depends on the type of solutions journalism you want to do. Obviously, if you want to put together a 1,500, 3,000 word feature story, that's going to take longer. But like we said, we can do these stories in like 600 words. I've trained some newsrooms that are really, really small. For example, there's a newsroom in Timmins that has 2 people on their masthead that has daily news deadlines. And they've managed to produce close to half a dozen solution stories since they were trained a couple of months ago. It's really a question of deciding what your priorities are and looking at what you can maybe do less of in order to make more time to do solutions journalism. Again, not every story that you put together is going to be a solution story. So trying to work some of those in every so often is more so the goal.
And sorry, I see some more questions here. Do you have any advice on pitching these types of stories to editors who might not be used to seeing things through a solutions lens? One thing I just wanted to flag is that the Solutions Journalism Network does have a section that will help you craft solutions journalism pitches. So you can always go and take a look at that on their website. Zia, do you have anything to add about pitching to editors?
I would say if you're writing stories, especially about communities that are underrepresented in media or who don't tend to be covered well in media, I think that you can talk about solutions journalism and that framework as an asset that's going to improve your coverage. So if we're looking at things like, for example, Indigenous communities, we tend to, as media, sort of like swoop in and tell the same sort of stories about the same sort of things over and over again. So we're talking about like crime and poverty and violence. And obviously that's not the full story. in those communities. There are tons of people within the community who are working to create change, and people don't feel represented when the only stories that come out of there are negative. So if you are talking about stories about specific communities where the media has sort of failed to adequately cover them in the past, talking about the ways that you can use solutions journalism to tell a fuller picture, I think is going to be an asset.
And then we've got some more questions here. Could you say a bit more about how to apply solutions journalism in the Quickie format? So there are a couple things that you can do to produce a story a little bit quicker. You can go for a response that's small and local, because obviously the smaller the response, the less you will have to cover it. You can work backwards from a positive deviance, so letting that data guide your reporting, or you can write about a widely known problem. Because the problem is already widely known in your community, you won't need to spend a lot of time covering it, and instead you can jump right into that solution. Zia, I don't know if you had any other suggestions for doing a Quickie story?
Nope, but I would suggest that people check out the tracker and look at how other journalists have put together stories that are less than 800 words, for example. So there's a ton of examples of how this can actually look in practice. And if you are wanting to put together some of those shorter stories yourself, I would really recommend looking at how it's been done in the past.
And there are written examples of Quickie stories, but also they can be done for radio and TV spots as well, just to flag that. All right, next question here. Do you have any tips for the slicing tactic and how to narrow down the focus of the problem?
I would say one tip is to not get bogged down by how wide a problem can get. I think one issue that often comes up in workshops is that people say, you know, this one response isn't going to solve the entire issue. And I think that we need to not worry about thinking about it in that specific way. I think we need to look at responses that are addressing a piece of a problem and what effect those responses have. Kim, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I would just add that I think that that's really important because often these problems are so overwhelming. You know, you could look at environmental degradation, access to education. They are such large problems. No one solution is ever going to be able to solve it. It's just not possible. No solution is a silver bullet. So really zero in on what a piece of the pie that's really important to you and also really important to your audience. I think that that can really help you narrow down your focus. But this is a very important thing to do before you begin your reporting. Otherwise, I think you'll just end up looking too many directions and your story won't really have that clear focus.
Yeah, and you can look at also which communities you want to be covering in your response as well and ask, you know, what's a piece of this problem that's really important to those communities that we're wanting to cover. So if you wanted to look at, say, LGBTQ plus folks, for example, then if poverty is your big slice, then maybe you're looking at like homelessness among LGBTQ plus youth. And then all of a sudden, the sort of modes for addressing that problem, they shrink in a pretty big way.
And this is an interesting question here. Who are the biggest resistors to solutions journalism? Have you come up against a lot of resistance, Zia?
I don't think so. I've had some people, you know, question whether or not they have the time to put together these stories. And I think that, you know, especially now during COVID, when we're all so busy and sort of just trying to keep afloat, there might be some resistance to try new things at a time that we're all stressed. But I think for the most part, when I've been talking to journalists in different newsrooms, there's certainly an openness to learn more about the approach. And at the very least, people have shown or have sort of reported that they think that the response is like interesting or useful to them in some way, and that the shift in thinking is one that makes sense to them. The biggest sort of resistance has really just been time.
I think I would say the same. Most of the journalist editors that I've spoken to, they're pretty excited about the approach. I think it's something that a lot of people, they kind of share the perspective of someone who spoke in the beginning video, Why haven't we been doing this all along? That's one of the pretty common responses that I've received. But in terms of some resistance, I will say that some people see solutions journalism as aligning too closely with advocacy, but this really is not true. Solutions journalism, when you're writing on a response, you're not advocating for a certain response. It's the response that you found and that you want to cover. Also, solutions journalism, we're not overclaiming or predicting the future. You know, we're providing people with that evidence, providing them with that limitation. You can also, and we're always making our story about the idea behind the program, not the people or the organization who might be running it. And as long as we really focus on, you know, that limitation pillar, I think that that advocacy, that suggestion that solutions journalism overlaps with advocacy, it's simply not true. I don't know if you've had any people come up to you and say that solutions journalism is advocacy. I don't like it. Sia?
No one's necessarily said that, but they have questioned sort of what separates it from advocacy. And in that case, I would say basically everything that you just pointed out, that we are talking about the limitations to a response, as that's a very important piece of doing solutions journalism. I would also point out that sometimes you go in to report on a response and you ultimately decide that it's not effective. And there can be a solution story about that as well. I had recently read a story about the use of chokeholds in the NYPD and why they were still being used against citizens, even though they had been banned for many years. And the journalist went in and looked at the ban as a response, and they found that it was useless because even when officers used chokeholds, there was no accountability. There was no sort of punishment if they were to use these chokeholds. So people didn't feel like they were afraid of getting caught or facing any negative consequences. So they could just sort of act with impunity. And so it ultimately ended up being a solution story about a response that was not effective.
And I think remembering it is rigorous reporting, but just instead of reporting on problems, now we're switching to reporting on solutions. And this is an interesting question too. Are there any outlets that are really killing it solutions journalism wise? Which outlets worldwide are the standard bearers for the field? Zia, do you want to mention any that you've seen first, and then I can go?
The New York Times is doing a lot of solutions journalism. One of the co-founders, or actually both of the co-founders of the Solutions Journalism Network, are New York Times journalists, and they have a regular column where they do solutions journalism there. Places like here in Canada, the Narwhal is doing a really good job at incorporating solutions journalism into their regular news output. The Guardian does a lot of solutions journalism as well. Kim, I don't know if you have names you want to add to that.
For Canada, I would also flag the Tyee, because they've been in the game for a long time. Maybe quite a bit longer than some of the other Canadian outlets that I've seen. If you'd like worldwide, Are We Europe? It's a magazine, and they actually did a full solutions journalism issue called The Silver Linings, where they reported on solutions to the pandemic in Europe. That was their best-selling issue as well, so I think it really resonated with their audience. And the BBC also does a do you remember the name of this, Sia? It's My Perfect World, I believe that's what it is.
My Perfect Country.
My Perfect Country, thank you. And so that is solutions focused as well, where the BBC takes a look at responses that are coming from other countries and whether or not they could be applied to their own. I think those are the big ones I would mention, but maybe also just to say that there are a lot of small outlets that are doing it well. You don't have to be this big outlet with huge amount of budget and a really big staff. We had a story in here from the St. Albert Today. They have done a number of solutions pieces, and they are a small newsroom out of St. Albert, Alberta. So lots of good examples from Canada and from the world as well. Okay, just looking at a couple of questions here. Zia, you might have an answer to this one. Do you happen to have a story, anecdote about a solution story you reported on and how you went about finding it and executing it?
So I haven't done any reporting myself, but when I'm not working at the Solutions Journalism Network and JHR, I work for Extra, which is an LGBTQ+ publication in Canada. And I've started as an editor, editing a bunch of solution stories for their health section, which is the section that I handle. And the question was, how did we go about finding and executing those stories?
Yes.
In terms of finding them, so we basically did sort of what we had outlined in this presentation. We looked at problems that we wanted to address and to find solutions to. So I will say, actually, I'm working on a story about detransition right now. So this idea that people will come out as trans and start transitioning, and then ultimately decide that that's not what they want and stop transitioning. So that's like a problem that's talked about a lot now in media, but the way that we're framing it is pretty flawed. A lot of the people who have sort of seized onto this narrative are like anti-trans folks, and they're talking about sort of like the dangers of transitioning. But we wanted to write a story about how, you can detransition and it can ultimately be fine. And we want to look at sort of what supports are available for people who choose to detransition that don't also carry a heavy anti-trans rhetoric. So we haven't necessarily found that solution just yet. This is something that we are working on looking into. But it's a question of, finding that problem and thinking, detransition is something that's talked about all over the world. There's got to be somebody who's doing a better job at supporting people who go through this process. And so looking to community groups, looking to people who have lived that experience and asking what helped them. These are some of the ways that we're looking at trying to find a solution or a response to the problem.
And I would just add in that something that a lot of outlets are doing is they're going directly to their communities, to their readerships, and asking, what are the problems that are most important to you? And then letting that guide their reporting. When you're going about executing it, I would point you back to resources on the Solutions Journalism Network. You can attend a story workshop where they can help you vet the solutioniness of your story, make sure that you're going in the right direction. If you're in Canada, in the West, you can always contact me and I can make sure that your solution story is going in the right direction. The same for Zia on the East. But there are lots of resources on the Solutions Journalism Network that can really help you make sure that that story is a true solution story.
Sometimes it's also a question of looking at problems that you've covered in the past and thinking about if there are ways that you can report on those differently. So I'll just give another example from Extra, looking at HIV rates. And we did a story about how Canada had failed to reach its goal for preventing new HIV cases or infections in Canada. And so this is something that we've reported on a bunch of times before that we'll likely keep reporting on. And so we decided to look at what are some of the possible solutions there, like what are ways that other countries have brought down their rates of infection for HIV, and why isn't Canada doing those things? Or how would Canada start to apply some of those responses?
And then I see another question here. This kind of journalism is really interesting. Can we introduce this in the Kenyan media space? I'm really interested in learning more about it and using it to find solutions. So I would suggest that if you are a viewer from outside of Canada, you go check out the Solutions Journalism Network. I know that they have started doing some work in the African continent, so you might want to reach out to them, make sure that you're on their Facebook page, their newsletters, so that you can keep aware of any opportunities that they might be bringing in your location. Are there any more questions? And of course, if you do have any additional questions, you can always email Zia or myself. We are here to be resources for Canadian newsrooms and Canadian journalists who are interested in beginning to use solutions journalism. Zia, did you have anything else to add? I see no more questions.
I guess I would just say if there are specific stories that you're working on that you would like to get some guidance on, you can also feel free to email us for that. And if you do produce any stories that you think might be solution stories after having taken this workshop, we would love to see them. So please do send them our way. We can submit them to the tracker for you, and we can also give you some feedback of our own about the 4 pillars of solutions journalism in those stories. don't be discouraged if you try once and you don't make it into the tracker right away. It can take a couple of times to really master getting those 4 elements in. But if you do work on some of these stories, we would absolutely love to see them and love to give you some feedback.
Great. Well, I think we just want to give a big thank you to everyone who tuned in today. We're really appreciative to have you here and hope that you have all learned something new and are excited about this approach.